old book, Ruth Ann Musick's HELL'S HOLLER, written as her PhD dissertation in 1943. Here is HELL'S HOLLER. It may look a good bit like the Chariton Valley. And I'm going to read a chapter after I read, then Adam Davis, who's general editor for Missouri Folklore Society Journal, and has become something of an expert on Ruth Ann Musick and certainly on folklore, will explain why a novel is folklore, and then something about how this novel fits in, and will sort of summarize the plot for us. And then Pat Musick, Ruth Ann Musick's niece, artist and folklorist at heart, right? We'll talk about Ruth Ann Musick, the family connections, and whatever else she wants to.
Yeah.
And the illustrations, yes. Okay, done by her father, Archie Musick, Ruth Ann's brother. Okay, so here comes chapter 1. It's got an Archie Musick illustration. Dinner at Mary's. The last strains of Turkey in the Straw diminished and died away. George Moore raised his chin from the fiddle and gazed out over the Missouri farmland. Beyond the patches of scrub oak and hickory, the Chariton Hills hovered along the blue haze of the river. The ruggedness of the hills, weaving up and down like a split rail fence, on and on, fascinated George, but their worthlessness, with the nearest market 15 miles away, reminded him of his own misfortunes. For George, with his bulk of body and broken down health, was no good as a farmer, and he knew it. He was marked by a sick cow. The red-headed woman peeling potatoes looked as if she would never finish her task. Her blue-dyed sugar sack dress, limp over sagging shoulders, gave her a kind of wilted Sweet Williams look, and her voice sounded dragged out, even when she sputtered. She glanced at the old wooden clock and turned to the bulk on the bed. George, how can you sit there with your ma and pa coming and so much to do? Well, what's there to do? His open mouth widened. For heaven's sakes, George, put down that squawking fiddle and get me some wood. Why, Mary, if I'd had any notion you wanted something done, I wish that I never left Iowa. You never get nothing done. I told you, and your pa told you, fix that lower bridge 2 months ago, before the rain set in and the creek gets up, and you ain't touched it yet. Some of the young'uns will be drowned, sure. That is, if they ever get out of bed from that summer complaint. Me nor Lawrence can't do that. We do everything else, my dear. George raised the eyes of a whipped dog. It rained all summer till last night. Young'un's been down in bed. Well, it's gonna rain now. I can't help it, Mary. Ain't got no health, marked like I am. I take medicine all the time, but don't seem to get no better. Worse, if anything, and taxes are coming on and all. As a feller says, I don't know what in the name of the Lord will become of us. She poured water on the potatoes and started cutting them in little chunks. Well, marked or not, if you'd have went to them rub doctors like Andrew said, and I always wanted, like as not they'd have rubbed some of it out of you, so we could have got along. Or if we'd have sold out to the government. Well, get me the wood now. Where's little Lawrence? He took some corn to the mill to be ground. He ought to be back before long. It ain't right. Him only 8 and doing a man's work, and me not able to do a thing, and the place needing fixing, and my tools wore out, and the mules old. Sometimes I just want to bust out and bawl. Well, don't think about it. I can't help it. I want to get my mind off my troubles, but I can't seem to get it off. I want to do the right thing, and I ain't able to do nothing. And as the feller says, George, please get me some wood. The fire will be out. Helpless against misfortunes, George plumped the violin in the wooden box under the bed and solemnly picked up the axe by the door. I wish to the Lord I was strong. He paused in the doorway. Here comes Lawrence now, and old Whitey's a limping worse than ever. It just looks like things get worse and worse every day. I don't know what in the name of God. George, for Lord's sake, get the wood. She looked up from the steaming iron kettle as the steady plop plop of the mule drew nearer and stopped. Mommy! A bang of the door, and she untied the red and blue lettered cotton bag as Lawrence slid down and tried to lift it to his back. His father's oversized straw hat gave a kind of umbrella look to his spindly frame. Lawrence, you can't carry so much. It's too heavy for you. He ran ahead to open the door. Inside, he helped himself to a raw potato and mumbled with crisp bites. I'm strong, Mommy. I ain't sick like Pappy. No. I wished he'd get better. Maybe I wouldn't have to sell Samson then. Well, he thinks he's sick and his ma does, and I reckon he is. They've been a doctoring him for over 30 years now. Looks to me like though if he was marked by 10 sick cows, he could do more than he does. Well, Mommy, he's always a thinking of us. Yes, but work do so much more good. There was a clatter of plates as Mary sat around the dishes from a stack in her arms. The boy watched, his head on one side. Mommy, why didn't Grandma and the rest of them want the government to take over the old mill and the dam and build a reservoir and all? Taxes, mostly, I reckon. They can't hardly pay 'em the way things are. And then, too, some of them would have had to sell, and they don't want no outsiders coming in. They don't want to move out. None of them. They've lived in these hills so long, they can't see things no other way. He braced himself against the rough hickory rocker. Looks like they'd want a reservoir for swimming and such. Samson would, I bet. Reckon I better feed Samson now. If you don't shut up about that pig every breath, I'll give him back to your grandma. Drag up some more wood before it rains. The boy's jaw dropped halfway to his chest, and his eyes, half hidden in tangled red hair, had the look of a ringed pig caught in a fence. His mother stared up from the cups and saucers. I didn't mean it about Samson, Lawrence. He's yourn. But we get along so poorly. I wish to the Lord we had a soul to the government and could get away from these hills summers where there's a law to keep young'uns in school. Mommy, I don't care nothing about school, honest. The long wooden spoon scraped noisily in the iron kettle where the beans simmered. I used to love these hills when I first married your pa and came to live here. Now I hate 'em. Why, Mommy? 'Cause there's no getting away. Seems like once you're here, you shut out from the rest of the world, have to work like a dog all your life to keep from starving to death. Is that time? Okay, I'm going to stop here and turn this over to Adam Davis. So go, Adam. That's half the first chapter. No, that's a third. Okay. So, Adam, I can't hear you. Adam, we can't hear you.
There we go. Yeah, I had my mute stuck. Sorry. Thank you so much, Betsy. That was a heartfelt reading, and we'll get to the language of that shortly. Betsy asked me to talk a little bit about the plot of the novel, where it goes from here. Much of it has already been set up. We've got George Moore, age 38, his 26-year-old wife, Mary. They've been married for 10 years or so, have a number of children, including Lawrence, who is cruelly overworked, and much too much is asked of him. And we've set up the central problem for the novel, which is that George is in some unspecified way poorly, and he's unable to work. And so all of the work devolves essentially on Mary and Lawrence. And it's really very hard to watch the cruelties to which these two are subjected. It's never resolved. It's never resolved the degree to which George suffers from some sort of organic illness and the degree to which these are character flaws that keep him from working. The novel was written at the end of the 30s, the beginning of the 40s, the high watermark for Freudian theory in its classical form. And there are hints tossed out along the way that George's condition comes from a mother who is overprotective of him and overbearing towards absolutely everyone else. What happens in the emotional trajectory of the novel is we accompany George as he comes nearer and nearer to some kind of self-understanding and some sort of a reckoning with himself. And this is actually where Ruth Ann Musick does her work as a novelist. So I'm not going to do any spoilers. I want you to read this and find out what happens as George comes a bit more face to face with George. The faculty of Iowa's creative writing program pronounced this a worthy novel, and a lifetime later I will affirm that judgment. This is worth your time. You're going to like this. How does this novel work into us for folklore? I encountered it in the early 2000s because I read Judy Priscilla Byers' article about her mentor, Ruth Ann Musick, and it mentioned that this novel was in existence someplace. So I got interlibrary loan to send me a copy from Iowa, and I read it, and I thought, this really ought to see the light of day. This really needs to be printed. Well, it's Missouri and things happen slowly. And then, now it's happening through a lot of hard work by Betsy and Pat, through this generosity. We're actually going to see it. How does it relate to folklore? It uses folkloric materials. Just in this first chapter, we heard about the sugar sack dress, and there are women in my family still alive who wore flour sack dresses. That's not anything very remote, and they were handed down in my family. Or the idea of being marked by a cow, and there's going to be some of this in every chapter, discrete items of folklore. And also, music seems to have had the conscious purpose of having certain set pieces organizing the narrative. So we will have a chapter that really focuses on a hog killing, and hog killing is an event in Greater Appalachia, which is the cultural framework for this, or rural court proceedings, which involve an overlap of formal jurisprudence and customary legal procedures. A square dance. There are lots of things like this that organize it. I would say that this is most interesting from a folklorist's point of view, in that Ruth Ann Musick is herself acting as a folklorist. What the novel does is it brings modern worlds and traditional worlds into contact and conflict in multiple ways, and very, very, very interesting ways. And so in doing this, Ruth Ann Musick is acting not simply as a field worker and a collector of objects of lore. She's also working as an analyst and a thinker about these things. it's going to be really, really interesting for residents of Kirksville and Adair County to read, for people who are acquainted with Northern Missouri, and as I say, the larger context. Just to start with the language, anybody who has done any dialect work recognizes there's a lot of Southern features in the language here, and Musick uses a lot of I dialect to represent it, and that's authentic. She's recording the speech of rural Adair Countyans in the late in the first half of the 20th century, probably largely out of her own recollection. And those people would have been one generation out of Kentucky and Tennessee. And they brought those speech ways with them, and they brought a lot of their other folk ways with them. It's also interesting in that she has set it against the background of real events in Adair County. You're going to run into what she calls the rub doctors. And Kirksville's great claim to fame is it's the founding spot for osteopathic medicine. Andrew Taylor Still's College of Osteopathic Medicine begins here. And as it originates, it comes out of a folk medical practice called bone setting. When Hamlet says, "The time is out of joint that ever I was born to set it right," he's borrowing a metaphor from bone setting and the idea that all ailments go back to misaligned bones. Andrew Taylor Still came out of this folk medical background, but he also put it into a new modern scientific framework and began practicing what we would recognize as standard clinical medicine. And the whole purpose of osteopathic medicine was to make a kind of patient-oriented practice available in rural communities that previously hadn't been. So the rub doctors are really a thing. They are dark, sinister figures in this book, and they're conspiring to steal the land and build a reservoir for unspecified purposes. They did in fact do that, but it was with benign intent. They ended up establishing a reservoir for the city of Kirksville and a great state park. Kirksville, which comes out as Keatsville here. Some things can be clearly mapped from the novel to the real world. The Sheraton River really exists, and this is set on the Sheraton River. Perhaps the settlement in the novel corresponds to the former Youngstown, perhaps to Novinger. It's hard to say. La Fever is a little town in the neighborhood of Keatsville. In real life, it's La Plata. And the asylum that figures so large in the second half of the novel, I don't know if that is meant to be the state hospital at Fulton, south of Columbia, or perhaps the osteopathic insane asylum at Macon. They seem to be suggesting it's somewhere near Kansas City. So I think this is an important part of our understanding of the novel is we don't want to turn it into autobiography. We want to understand that Ruth Ann Musick was processing a lot of materials from her life, from the world that she observed. But she's making art. She's making a novel. So just to conclude, just to wrap that up, this is a novel that incorporates folk materials and it deploys folkloric analysis. It's not itself an item of folklore. It's something more complex and sophisticated than that. You're gonna love it. I'm done.
Okay, well, thank you, Adam. And now we're turning to Pat Musick.
Okay, well, thank you, Adam and Betsy. So I thought I would just try and talk a little bit about Ruth Ann Musick's background and her family and where she came up with some of this material and her going on to be a folklorist in West Virginia. And also the close relationship she had with her brother, who was my father. And he illustrated all of her published books in her lifetime, including Telltale Lilac Bush, and others. So when Adam approached me about publishing this book, I thought, wow, wouldn't it be great if we could put some of my dad's sketches with that, since he had moved to Colorado, but he frequently went back to Missouri, especially during his art school bachelor days. And I had sketchbooks of his that are labeled Kirksville and with images that are clearly Missouri and not Colorado. So we compiled a number of these, and Adam and Betsy matched them to the text to illustrate the action in the story as closely as we could. And much later in the process, almost right up to the last minute, I found a letter from Ruth to my father saying, "What a great idea for you to illustrate my novel." So it had been planned all along that he would illustrate, and he had actually done at least one finished illustration specifically for the novel, which is one that I had found, recognized as coming from an image, a photograph of him as a small boy. And it turned out in the letter that she was asking him to base one of the illustrations on that very same photograph. So here is young Lawrence, AKA Archie Musick, at about the age of 8. I had not read the novel itself. I had read all of her collections of West Virginia folklore, and she was a fantastic character. She was a favorite aunt of mine, full of enthusiasm and energy, and as Judy Perzillo Byers has said in her afterword, a great champion of the underdog. And the underdog could be animals, could be people, and in her folkloric work, it could be ghosts. She felt that ghosts were given a bad rap, and that most of the ghosts came back. In the stories she collected, the predominance of ghosts coming back were those looking to help the living, rather than to haunt or exact revenge. So in reading the novel, it was fascinating for me to find these echoes of her childhood that I recognized from some of the things my father had written about their childhood. Experiences on the farm, and in fact, the hog killing is almost a word for word description that is identical to one that my father wrote. So there are persons and incidents in the novel that are taken directly from her life. But those were the kind of the outline, the framework on which she hung her own story. And the conundrum with George is, how much is he a hypochondriac? How much is he really ill? How much is he under the thumb of his mother? And particularly weaving in the folk belief in this having been marked by a sick cow when his mother was pregnant, and therefore he was just born ill and he would never be able to do anything. And she pumps him full of pills as a preventive medication from the time he's a small boy. And one thing that I found in my aunt's papers was that a proposal for a biography of A.T. Still, the founder of osteopathy. And in that proposal, she notes that many of the Hill people believe in pills, that pills somehow make you well. And so that factor itself was based on some of her reality. So she had a great interest in folklore all along. Her mother sang ballads and songs to her from Ireland, the Irish and English ballads. Her father was apparently a great storyteller. And she was interested in the folklore of Missouri, but at that time, I think Vance Randolph was considered to be the one who had a corner on the market. And she got a teaching job in West Virginia and just fell completely in love with West Virginia and collected, although she taught English and math there, she collected a great deal of lore from her students there, wrote 2 folklore columns in which people could send in beliefs and stories as well. So she was energetic and fiery, and also, I think, torn, as you see in the novel, between the solidity and respecting the beliefs of the hill people, but also realizing how, in many ways, they were held back by many of those beliefs and superstitions. And so how to balance the two elements of the folk beliefs and education. So I think that's part of the tension that is being worked out in the novel, as well as other aspects of her life. And that's about all I have as a general background. So Adam and Betsy, do you have anything you'd like me to say?
I'd like you to show us one of the pictures, but first a question. In that little text that I read, Lawrence doesn't care about schooling. That becomes a feature later on. His mother wishes there were a law that made people go to school. How maybe Adam knows more.
Mm-hmm.
What sort of education would someone in the Chariton Hills expect? Until 12 years old? Not at all? I don't know.
Well, the one-room schoolhouse that was located at Sloan's Point, which would have been very much what Musick had in mind, burned down last year in a meth accident. And that is such a parable of Adair County. That school was in service until the mid-1970s, from Ruth Ann Musick's childhood into the mid-1970s. Musick herself was schooled in Kirksville and went to the Kirksville Public School. She was a town girl, but she was clearly aware of the kind of really wrenching poverty that people in the outlying districts lived in, and she would have been aware, living at the normal school essentially, that rural education was a research focus that cannot possibly have escaped her attention. That the one-room schoolhouse was a new scientific development, and they were trying to bring that. I think in the novel we're looking at a world where that isn't really available to them fully.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, my impression from some of the papers I was going through, or some of her other fiction perhaps, was that you were an educated person if you completed the 8th grade. But she does, one of her novels, so she left her folklore archive of West Virginia folklore to Fairmont State College, now university. And it's now archived at the Frank and Jane Gabor West Virginia Folklife Center at the university. But she left her fiction writings to her brother. So I have a trove of more novels and stories and a couple of plays. And one of them was a novel called A Little Learning, in which she says, basically she makes the argument that just because someone is ignorant or illiterate she says, is not the root of all evil, as some people may believe. So-called, quote, educated people, or people who overestimate their knowledge, without any common sense whatsoever, who insist upon being leaders in a community or town, although they are utterly unfit for leadership, may do more harm than the totally uninformed person, or even the complete ignoramus or idiot. So she is in the novel, which is seems to have some autobiographical elements. There's a girl from the hills who really wants to go to college, and I have not read the whole novel, but I infer that in the course of it, she realizes that education doesn't necessarily give you common sense. So I think these are some of the themes that are maybe teased at or hinted at in in Hell's Holler, although they had not yet been developed very fully. This is her first novel, and she did go on to write these other pieces of fiction, many of them in West Virginia later, but many of them are still located in Missouri. So she's, you know, once a Missourian, always. Yeah.
I think we'd be interested in seeing some more of those things.
Okay. And I must say, I do have to say this also, that I know, and I knew from Judy, and then I learned more from other cousins on that side of the family, how very much she cared about the characters in this novel and how eager she was to have it be published. So I'm sure that wherever she is now, she's absolutely thrilled that it's seeing the light of day. She did work on it some more and refine it in a later iteration that's basically the same story with a little bit more to it later on. But this is her maiden voyage in writing fiction. And she did publish 3 books of collected folklore from West Virginia, well, 4. And then posthumously another one of children's folklore from collected in West Virginia. And there are a number of more books that Judy Byers is working on from the unpublished archives of West Virginia folklore. So there's more to come yet. And that series is going to be called A Passel of Ghosts. So here are some of the, so here's the old sketchbook. And here's one of the Missouri scenes. And I believe we have the cover image from the novel in another sketchbook. So this one. So again, these were sketches that my father made when he went back to visit his mother, who was still in Kirksville in the 40s. And we were able to find a number of images in these sketchbooks that seem to match some of what was going on in the book.
So we've got about 25 or 30 of these sketches in the book.
I'd like to thank you, Pat, so much for your generosity in sharing your father's work, and Betsy and Neil. I think you're out there someplace, Neil.
Yes,
thank you. Thank you so much for your tireless labors and your ingenuity. It's a beautiful production. I haven't held the physical book yet, but I've looked at the final lockdown PDF, and this is. I hope Dr. Musick feels fulfilled wherever she is.
I'm sure that she does. I'm sure she's absolutely tickled.
Okay. Time?
Okay, so we can stop recording.
Yeah.